My name is Rachel Dwyer. I'm 46, and I used to believe that results spoke louder than noise. I had built my career not through slogans or LinkedIn posts, but through substance. For over a decade, I was the VP of Strategic Communications at Bierman & Fox, one of the most respected marketing firms on the East Coast. I wasn't the kind of person who made headlines. I made them for other people. Politicians in crisis, tech CEOs mid-scandal, fashion brands collapsing from bad press. I was the quiet force that cleaned it up. My clients didn't need inspiration. They needed control, clarity, and results, and I delivered every single time. When I joined Bierman & Fox, the communications department was chaotic and reactionary. No process, no real structure, just people scrambling to put out fires. Over the years, I reshaped it into a precision unit. I built a team of 22 hand-picked professionals. I mentored them, protected them, and raised standards across the board. My work had brought in some of the firm's highest profile account. I didn't shout about it. I didn't take selfies at conferences. I didn't need to. The board knew me, the clients trusted me, my team respected me. That was enough. But that changed last fall when the company brought in a new CEO, Ashley Crown. She was 34, full of charm, and a rising star from a startup scene in LA. Her reputation was built more on perception than performance. Her last company had burned through 2 rounds of funding before quietly disappearing, but you'd never guess that from her LinkedIn. Every bullet point there was a polished monument to spin. She gave TEDx talks about emotional branding and the power of presence. Her arrival was marked with phrases like reimagining energy and human-centered storytelling. It all sounded pretty, but meant nothing. On her first day, Ashley walked into my office with a soft smile and said, "I've heard great things. You're like the backbone here." I nodded politely. Then she added, "But let's be real. I want people who sparkle. People who make noise. You're more grounded, like a foundations." "Foundations keep everything else from collapsing," I replied. She laughed, but her eyes didn't. What followed were changes, not obvious ones at first. Ashley brought in consultants who talked about vibes and fresh resonance. We had mandatory culture reset sessions on Friday afternoons. The company logo changed, then the color palette, then the mission statement. The work didn't improve, but the social media metrics did. Ashley started appearing in live streams with motivational captions. I kept my team focused on actual client crises while the upstairs floor turned into a content studio. Then came the influencer. Her name was Blair Nix, 27 years old, previously known for a viral video titled "Why Gen Z Won't Buy Your Brand Unless You Dance." She had a podcast, a merch line, and a signature neon aesthetic. No background in strategic communication, no corporate experience, but over 1 million followers and an agent. Ashley introduced her at an all-hands meeting as our new Chief Brand Presence Officer, a position that until that day did not exist. And then she looked straight at me and said, "Rachel will help onboard her. I want Blair to understand how we used to do things so she can break the mold." I smiled. I always did. But inside, I knew what this was. They weren't looking for stability. They were looking for flash. They didn't want someone who built. They wanted someone who posed. And I had just been publicly replaced, not by competence, but by clout. Training Blair Nix was an exercise in restraint. On paper, I was supposed to introduce her to our systems, workflows, and client dynamics. In reality, I was babysitting a brand. Blair wasn't interested in how we managed press during litigation or the strategic layers of a message tree. She wanted to know how we could make crisis communications more aesthetic. She once asked if we could color code our client tiers by vibe. During one session, I was explaining escalation protocol for a major pharmaceutical account, and she interrupted to ask if she should wear something more bold for the client Zoom call. I told her we were handling a product recall involving infant medication. She blinked and said, "That sounds not very brand safe." It would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. Ashley, of course, adored her. She reposted Blair's behind-the-scenes office photos, gushed over her energy, and quoted her in meetings as if she were a thought leader instead of a walking filter. The title Chief Brand Presence Officer suddenly started appearing in company press releases, and soon Blair was doing video series for our own social channels, all while attending none of the high-stakes client meetings. My role shifted without warning, no memo, no conversation, just a quiet repositioning. I stopped being CC'd on strategy emails. Projects I had led for years were rerouted to Blair for visual storytelling alignment. My team started receiving directives from her assistant instead of me. When I asked Ashley directly if something was going on, she smiled and said, "You've been carrying so much for so long. Let others lead now. You've earned rest." Rest. The word tasted like exile. It was clear now. Ashley didn't have the courage to fire me directly. She wanted to freeze me out gently, to make me irrelevant and eventually unnecessary. It was a strategic form of slow suffocation. One afternoon, I logged into our internal portal and saw that my name had been moved from the executive leadership section to advisory staff. That hadn't been discussed with me. My job title was intact technically, but the implication was deafening. The worst part? No one said anything. No explanation, no clarification, just the collective corporate silence that follows quiet decisions. Coworkers stopped asking for my input in meetings. One of my own hires called Blair our new voice during a client call and didn't even realize how that must have sounded. The final blow came on a Tuesday, wrapped in a calendar invite titled Touch Base, HR. I knew what that meant. I'd seen the pattern play out for others. I dressed well that morning, like I always did. Black slacks, silk blouse, minimal jewelry. I sat in the glass conference room with an HR rep and Ashley across the table, both wearing sympathetic expressions like masks. Ashley leaned forward and said, "Rachel, this is hard. You've meant so much to this company, but we're moving in a different direction, one that's more dynamic, more resonant with where the industry is going. We believe it's time for a change in leadership tone." I said nothing. She continued, "We'd like to offer a generous transition package and a 6-month advisory option if you'd like to stay connected, but your position as it currently stands will be sunset by the end of the month." Sunset. As if my career were some dated product being discontinued. I looked her in the eye and nodded once. Understood. The HR woman handed me a folder. I didn't even open it. Ashley reached out her hand and I ignored it. I stood, thanked them for their time, and walked out of that room like I was walking through fog. Not because I was lost, but because I needed them to think I was. When I returned to my office, a few colleagues glanced up from their desks but quickly looked away. No one asked if I was okay. No one hugged me. The memo had gone out already, clearly. My assistant, poor Amy, looked stricken when I told her to cancel the rest of my week's meetings. "Rachel, they didn't?" I just smiled and said, "It's handled." She offered to help pack up my things. I declined. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted space. I packed my photos, my notebooks, my fountain pen, and my favorite leather portfolio. I left behind the awards on the shelf and the plaque with my name outside the office door. Let them pretend I was never there. As I walked to the elevator, I passed Blair filming something on her phone in the hallway, probably another day in the life of a young executive clip. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did and chose not to. Either way, I didn't stop. I stepped into the elevator alone. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirrored wall. Calm, composed, unreadable. I had given that company 12 years, and in return, they gave me a pink slip wrapped in hashtags. But what they didn't know, what no one in that building knew, was that I had been planning for this moment long before Ashley ever walked through those doors. They thought they were pushing me out. In truth, they were opening the exact door I'd been quietly building behind their back. The morning after I left Bierman and Fox, I woke up at 6:00 a.m. out of habit, no alarm, just my body, conditioned by years of early meetings and last-minute crises. I sat on the edge of my bed and let the silence settle in. My husband Mark was still asleep. He had offered the night before to take a few days off to help me process everything. I told him not to. There was nothing to process. Not really. Not anymore. Because what Ashley and her pet influencer didn't know, what no one at Bierman and Fox had ever asked, was what I had been building quietly for the past 9 months. While they posted team brunches and brainstormed slogans like "disrupt the expected," I'd been building something real. It started subtly, a conversation with my lawyer over coffee, a casual lunch with a former client just catching up, reserving a domain name one evening while waiting at the airport. These weren't acts of rebellion, they were acts of survival. I didn't trust the new leadership from the moment I saw how fast they cared about being seen and how little they cared about being competent. And I knew that someday I would no longer belong in that building. So I prepared. I filed paperwork for an LLC under the name North Hill Strategies. I hired a discreet accountant to handle early tax structures. I worked with a freelance designer to create basic branding. Clean, minimal, professional. I didn't share any of it online, not even with close friends. I wasn't ready to be seen yet. I was still in the foundation stage. Over the next few months, I started planting seeds. During industry events, I stayed late for the quiet conversations after panels. When clients called my cell out of hours, I picked up. Not because I had to, but because I wanted them to remember what it felt like to have someone who knew their business better than their own staff. I never badmouthed the company. I didn't need to. People already knew something had changed there, and not for the better. A few clients asked me directly, "Are you planning to leave?" I smiled and said, "Not yet." That yet lingered in the air longer than the answer. One night over dinner, I told Mark the whole plan. He looked at me carefully, the way he does when he's trying to find the catch in something that sounds too clean. "So, you're building your own firm, in secret?" "Not in secret," I said. "In silence. There's a difference." He raised his glass and clinked mine. "Just make sure they don't see it coming." "They won't," I said. "That's the point." After the firing, I didn't take time off. I didn't take a vacation. I didn't take a break to recharge or rediscover myself. I already knew who I was. I spent the next 3 days finalizing paperwork, sending secured emails, and activating dormant plans. My LLC was live, my bank account linked, my logo finalized, my virtual office staff briefed. I worked long hours, quietly, efficiently, the way I always had. I didn't post anything online. No vague quotes about new chapters, no moving on updates. I didn't even change my job title on LinkedIn. I wanted silence, not attention. I wanted the first sound they heard from me to be a thunderclap, not a whisper. The real turning point came on a Thursday afternoon when I got a call from Marlon Grant, one of our biggest clients at Bierman & Fox, the same man who once told me I was the only reason he stuck with the firm during the shareholder lawsuit. "I heard they let you go," he said. "Is that true?" "Let's just say I'm no longer on the team," I replied. He paused. "What are you doing next?" I told him the truth. "Launching something of my own, quietly." Another pause, then, "Send me the paperwork. I want in." That was the first contract. 3 others followed that week. These weren't just clients, they were anchors. The kind of accounts that kept firms afloat, that paid retainers big enough to fund an entire department. And they didn't hesitate. They didn't ask for decks or bios or case studies. They just said, "Whatever you're doing, we want you doing it for us." That was the moment I knew it wasn't personal. It was professional. I had built something that no CEO or influencer could replace: trust. I hired a small team, 2 people I'd worked with years ago, and 1 rising star I had mentored before the culture at Bierman & Fox went performative. We operated remotely, but efficiently. I didn't need a corner office or a private barista or a branded hashtag. I needed results. And within 4 weeks, North Hill Strategies was profitable. I worked from my home office, a small, sunlit room that overlooked the quiet street where we lived. No glass walls, no performative brainstorms, just strategy, precision, and execution. It felt like returning to something pure, something before the noise, before the filters and influencers and synthetic culture. And as I looked at my calendar stacked with real clients, real problems, real outcomes, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Intro. They thought they stripped me of my relevance. What they really did was free me from the noise. And now that I had nothing to lose, I could finally start doing things on my own terms. Launching North Hill Strategies into the market was never about making noise. I didn't buy ads. I didn't send out flashy press releases or announce anything on social media. I wasn't interested in being seen. I was interested in being effective. That had always been the difference between me and people like Ashley and Blair. They curated attention. I cultivated trust. And in our industry, That difference was everything. In the first 6 weeks of operation, we went from 3 clients to 7, quietly, strategically, all through personal referrals. There were no billboards or hashtags, just results. A pharmaceuticals account landed after the client's PR director called me in tears because Bierman and Fox had mishandled a sensitive investor situation. A legal firm came on board after I helped contain a partner scandal before it reached the press. One by one, familiar names reappeared in my inbox, not because I chased them, but because they remembered. I hadn't built a brand, I'd built a reputation. I worked 12-hour days from my home office, sometimes more, but not because I had to, because I was building something I believed in on my terms. The culture was lean, sharp, no fluff. My team operated like a strike unit, fast, competent, collaborative. I wasn't interested in hierarchy or inflated titles. Everyone contributed, everyone was accountable. I checked every major deliverable personally. There were no assistants filtering my inbox, no layers of communication between me and the client. I was the point of contact. And that made people feel safe, which is exactly what you want when your company is on the verge of public embarrassment. At one point, I got a call from a former colleague who still worked at Bierman and Fox. We hadn't spoken in over a year. Her voice was tense. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Blair posted a TikTok during a client meeting. She filmed herself lip-syncing while the client was talking on Zoom and forgot to mute. It went viral. The client saw it and pulled the account. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I asked, was it a big account? She laughed bitterly. It was our biggest. I thanked her for the call, hung up, and went back to work. But inside, I smiled. Not because of the fallout, but because it confirmed what I already knew. Style could never replace substance. Not forever. A week later, a different former client reached out. This one had been loyal to Bierman and Fox for nearly 2 decades. "We need help," he said. "Ashley's team is scattered. No one follows through. The younger hires are all flair, no execution. They don't even understand our industry." I didn't gloat. I didn't even mention my past. I just said, "Let's talk about what you need." And he came over, not alone, with 3 other executives. That meeting lasted 4 hours and ended with a signed retainer agreement on my desk. Just like that, I had the client Bierman and Fox was supposed to never lose. That moment wasn't just a win. It was confirmation that the center had shifted. Their firm had gone from dominant to desperate, and they hadn't even realized it. Meanwhile, the investor meeting I had been quietly preparing for was approaching. A private equity group I'd been loosely connected to for years had heard about my firm, quietly of course. A mutual connection mentioned us during a dinner, and within days I was invited to present. Not pitch, present. That was important. They weren't looking to save me. They were interested in partnering with me. The meeting took place in a high-rise boardroom downtown. In wearing a charcoal suit, no frills. My deck was clean. 3 slides, 5 minutes, all numbers. Revenue growth, client retention, media outcomes. That's all they cared about. That's all I delivered. When I finished, they nodded. One of them leaned back and said, "No fluff. That's rare." "That's the brand," I replied. 2 weeks later, I had a 7-figure investment and full operational independence. No board, no oversight, just growth capital and the room to scale. The first thing I did was expand my crisis response division. I knew where the market was going. Faster scandals, shorter news cycles, more reputational damage with higher stakes. I hired 2 veterans from DC firms, people who could work under pressure and didn't need to be taught the difference between visibility and vulnerability. We started offering 24/7 crisis coverage to select clients. It was expensive, it was exclusive, and it sold out within a month. Suddenly, North Hill Strategies wasn't just a boutique firm, it was a whisper in elite circles, the place you called when you couldn't afford failure. The part that no one saw coming, though, the part that mattered most, was how the shift affected Bierman and Fox. Their quarterly report leaked. Revenue had dropped 27%. Client churn had doubled. Several executives resigned within the same month. And Blair, she stopped posting. Her LinkedIn, once a daily storm of hashtags and humble brags, went silent. Rumors floated that she was reassigned to internal content and no longer allowed on client calls. One night, scrolling through industry news, I saw a headline, "Legacy Firm Faces Identity Crisis in the Wake of Digital Disruption." I didn't click. I didn't need to. I had written that headline a year ago. I just didn't know it yet. Now, for the first time in years, I was no longer surviving. I was building. Not for someone else's vision, not to protect someone else's image, but for myself. And for the people who still believe that good work, real work, speaks loudest when you say nothing at all. And while Ashley chased impressions, I had already made mine. The difference was mine actually lasted. By the third month, the name North Hill Strategies was starting to echo through back channels. It wasn't public, not in the way most firms crave attention. There were no articles, no awards, no staged interviews, but it circulated where it mattered. In the inboxes of general counsels, in the texts between CMOs, in the private WhatsApp groups where founders whispered about disasters before they hit the news. We weren't branding ourselves, we were being branded by results, and that was the most powerful kind of marketing there is. The industry didn't need another agency shouting for attention. It needed one that could solve problems, quietly and with authority. That's what I had built. That's what we were becoming. It was around that time I started to hear whispers from inside Bierman & Fox, nothing concrete at first, just murmurs. A friend from a law firm forwarded me an email chain that included a comment from their current head of communications. Honestly, I miss Rachel. She got it. These new people, they want to co-create deliverables. I just want someone who understands NDAs. It made me laugh, not because it was surprising, but because it was inevitable. Bierman & Fox had gutted their core. They mistook branding for identity. They replaced execution with presence. And now the cracks were showing. Clients were leaving, staff were exhausted, deadlines were missed. And Ashley, she kept doubling down on redefining the brand experience. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, though I hadn't known I was waiting for it until it happened. I received a formal request from a Fortune 100 company for a crisis containment project. The kind of client Bierman & Fox would have sacrificed anything to land. The request came from the chief legal officer herself. She had worked with me years ago when I'd helped clean up a very delicate issue involving international partnerships and internal leaks. Her message was short. We're in a situation, need discretion. I'm told you're the one to call. I cleared my calendar. I put together a micro team. We worked round the clock for 4 days. Buried the problem before it became a headline and renegotiated their media training protocols from the ground up. When it was over, she wired payment in full plus a bonus. Then she said something I won't forget. We tried Bierman & Fox first. They brought a ring light to the meeting. At that point, I knew the balance had shifted. I wasn't just surviving their rejection. I was thriving in the space they used to occupy, and they knew it. I was certain of that when I received a cold, templated email from one of their mid-level managers asking if North Hill Strategies would be available to partner on overflow crisis accounts. It was laughable. They had become so bloated with surface-level work and bad hires that they were now trying to subcontract the very people they had dismissed. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I was already executing my next move. For months, I had kept quiet about one specific strategy, client positioning. Not just taking their business, but strategically placing case studies, anonymous testimonials, and back-end referrals into the networks that used to belong to Bierman & Fox. By the time their executive team realized what was happening, several of their past clients were now giving keynote slots and funding access exclusively through channels I had helped build. I didn't go to war with them. I replaced them. Then, the real moment arrived, the one that tied everything together. I received a direct request from Bierman & Fox's board. Not Ashley, not her assistant, the board. Apparently, their revenue had continued to decline. Investor confidence was slipping, and an internal audit revealed some significant deficiencies in leadership communication. The board wanted a third-party audit of their brand, their communication flow, and their executive media preparedness. The request came through a consultancy I'd partnered with before. But it was clear who they wanted. Me. I took the meeting out of curiosity, not necessity. It was held in the same boardroom where I had once presented annual strategy reports that no one had read. I walked in dressed as I always did, nothing flashy, just clean, confident. They didn't recognize me at first, not because I looked different, but because I carried myself differently now. I didn't belong to them anymore. The room was tense. Ashley was there. as was Blair. Both of them seated to the side. I could see the discomfort on their faces. Ashley was trying to maintain control, but she looked thinner, more tired. Blair didn't meet my eyes. A senior board member gestured to the seat at the head of the table. I took it. "Thank you for being here, Ms. Dwyer," he said. I simply nodded and opened my folder. Let's begin. Over the next 2 hours, I walked them through the firm's structural weaknesses, public perception issues, and brand credibility gaps. I didn't attack Ashley directly. I didn't need to. Everything I said was backed by data, client feedback, and media metrics. It was clinical, brutal in its precision. At one point, someone asked, "How would you reposition this agency to regain relevance?" I looked at Ashley, then at Blair, and answered, "You start by replacing your filters with strategy." They didn't say anything. At the end of the meeting, the board thanked me. One of them stood and asked, "Would you be open to leading a transitional oversight phase?" I smiled and said, "No, but I'll assign someone." Then I turned to Ashley and Blair. "You'll report to her. She'll contact you Monday." I closed my folder, stood, and walked out without waiting for a response. It wasn't about humiliation, it wasn't about revenge, it was about clarity. They had underestimated the wrong person, and now they would spend the foreseeable future answering to someone trained in my model, under my standard, rebuilding a structure I had once given them for free, and they had thrown away for likes. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't burn bridges, I just walked across a better one I built myself. The Monday after that boardroom meeting, I received a short, cautious email from Blair. It was polite, almost stiff, asking what time her new supervisor would be reaching out. I forwarded it to Kara, my operations lead, the same woman they once dismissed as too formal for client-facing roles. Kara scheduled the call for 7:00 a.m., not because it was necessary, but because it made a point. That was the beginning of a slow, methodical transfer of power. Bierman and Fox, once the loudest name in our space, was now an agency operating under an invisible leash. They still had their logo, their building, their old headlines, but the direction, the process, the standard, they were now being dictated by a playbook they had discarded and I had refined. From a distance, I watched it all unfold. I didn't interfere, I didn't make public comments, but I stayed informed. The internal friction became more obvious as the weeks passed. Multiple employees left. At least 2 clients quietly transitioned their accounts to us through intermediaries. I received an unsigned thank you card with a note. "I stayed too long, but now I see what you meant." I didn't recognize the handwriting. It didn't matter. I understood the sentiment. Their house was collapsing from the inside, and I wasn't lifting a finger. I didn't have to. They had brought this on themselves. Meanwhile, North Hill Strategies was accelerating. We weren't just winning clients anymore. We were shaping policy, managing multi-layered crises, helping companies prepare for media landmines before they even stepped onto the field. Our reputation was no longer whispered, it was spoken clearly, but selectively, the kind of name that executives passed along behind closed doors when they needed real results and didn't want theater. We weren't interested in volume, we were interested in leverage, and the more noise others made, the more powerful our silence became. My team had grown from 5 to 15. I promoted 2, hired 3 from firms I once competed with, and rejected every resume that mentioned influencer brand synergy more than once. Our culture was simple. We don't post unless it's about our clients, and even then, only after the problem is solved. We don't celebrate deliverables, we celebrate discretion. That's how we began attracting not just business, but respect. The kind you can't buy with PR packages or panels. Then came the moment that, in retrospect, felt like the closing act of a story I never asked to be part of. The same board that had asked for my consultation requested a final in-person meeting. A reset, they called it. I agreed, though I didn't see the need. I had already given them more than they deserved. But curiosity won. It took place in a different room this time. Smaller, less ceremonial, more stripped down. No fancy catering, no AV setup, just people who finally understood that perception without structure was empty. Ashley was not present. I didn't ask why. Blair was, though she looked smaller somehow, no longer dressed like a broadcast, but like a person. She nodded at me, not smiling. There were no filters between us now. The meeting was brief. They confirmed that their transitional oversight phase would become a standing agreement for external governance. They asked if I'd be willing to serve on an advisory council moving forward. I declined. I wasn't interested in being a lifeline for something that had once treated me like dead weight. I recommended someone else, another woman they had once overlooked. They accepted without resistance. As I prepared to leave, Blair stood. "Can I ask something?" she said, not with her usual self-assurance, but with the guarded energy of someone who had learned too much too quickly. "Why didn't you ever go public with any of this? You could have destroyed us." I looked at her, studying her for a moment. She wasn't a villain, just a symptom. "Because I didn't need to," I said. "You destroyed yourselves. I just gave you the silence to hear it." She didn't argue, she just nodded, and I left. That afternoon, I returned to the North Hill office, now a minimalist suite in a converted building downtown, light, quiet, efficient. My team was already deep into strategy reviews for a new pharmaceutical launch and a hedge fund under investigation. I stepped into my glass-walled office, sat down, and looked at the whiteboard with our current roster. Clean, sharp, solid. These weren't just clients. They were partners, people who had chosen substance over style. Later that week, I attended a private leadership summit, invite only, no cameras. As I took my seat in the back row, I noticed the nameplate at the front of the panel, "The Future of Strategic Trust." I wasn't speaking. I didn't want to. I was there to listen. But during the Q&A, someone asked the moderator how firms can recover after major talent loss and poor leadership decisions. The moderator didn't hesitate. They can't, usually, he said, but if they're lucky, they end up answering to the person they underestimated. I didn't move, but I saw a few heads turn my way. It wasn't recognition. It was realization. That was enough. They had taken my job, my title, my office, but they couldn't take my standard. They couldn't take my history, and now they were living under it, operating by it, enforced by it. That was the most elegant justice of all. Not revenge through exposure, but through excellence. Not by screaming, but by succeeding in silence so loudly they had no choice but to listen. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I finally allowed myself to stop. Not permanently, just long enough to notice that I had built the thing I once thought I had to beg for. The house was still, the coffee was hot, and the sky outside my kitchen window was the kind of gray that made the world feel calm. I didn't have a single meeting on my calendar, no crisis to intercept, no boardroom to recalibrate, just space. I sat at the table, fingers curled around my mug, and let the silence stretch. Not the kind that comes from isolation, but the kind that follows closure. Peace earned, not given. Mark walked in, barefoot and yawning, and glanced at the newspaper I wasn't reading. He looked at me the way he always had, without question, without tension, just with quiet pride. "You finally look like you believe it's over," he said. I smiled. "Because it is." He raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly is over?" I didn't hesitate. The part of me that needed their approval. That was the truth. I had spent too many years convincing myself that loyalty guaranteed safety. That if I worked hard enough, stayed long enough, delivered consistently enough, they would see me as indispensable. But I had learned something deeper. Indispensable is just a word companies use until they find someone shinier, cheaper, or easier to control. But legacy? That's something no one can take. North Hill Strategies was stable now, no longer a fragile startup, but a respected entity. The firm had outgrown its original projections, its original space, even its original purpose. What began as a reaction had become a standard. We didn't chase clients anymore, they found us. And they stayed because we offered something rare: clarity without ego, expertise without spectacle. We didn't ask for trust, we earned it. And in a world obsessed with visibility, our strength came from discretion. Every so often, I still received updates from people connected to Bierman and Fox. Some employees left quietly, some tried to rebuild from within. The firm still existed, technically, but it was a hollow version of what it had once been. Their name carried weight, but the spine was gone. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't even feel vindicated. I felt distant, like watching a city you once lived in slowly change into something unrecognizable. You remember the streets, but you no longer belong there. And that's okay. One afternoon, I received an envelope, no return address, handwritten. Inside was a note. You were right, about everything. I didn't understand then, I do now. Thank you for the standard. No name, just that. I folded the paper once, placed it in my drawer, and closed it. There was nothing else to say. Later that week, a junior staffer asked if I ever missed it. The title, the office, the public validation. I looked at her and said, no, I miss nothing that can be taken away. She nodded slowly as if absorbing something she hadn't learned yet but would one day need. That's how legacies are passed, quietly, without ceremony, one truth at a time. That evening, I left the office a little earlier than usual. I walked through the city as the lights flickered on, blending into the sky like gold dust. I passed the building where I had once spent a decade proving myself to people who had already decided I didn't matter. And I kept walking. No need to look up. I already knew what they'd see if they looked down. They'd see the woman they once called too quiet, too old, too serious, now building the future they were trying to rent a seat in. And they'd know. Without words, without drama, without revenge, just the slow, undeniable weight of excellence. That was the win. That was the ending. And it was perfect.